3 days before he found her, Wyatt Callahan sat alone by a small campfire, watching sparks rise into the endless black of the Arizona night. The coffee in his tin cup had gone cold, forgotten as he stared into the flames. 12 years of drifting had taught him to appreciate these moments of solitude, but tonight, the silence weighed on him differently. Earlier that day, he'd passed through a small settlement, barely enough buildings to warrant a name on any map. He'd stopped only long enough to buy ammunition and coffee, but the storekeeper had been talkative, desperate for conversation in that lonesome outpost. "Heading where, stranger?" the man had asked, measuring coffee beans into a burlap sack. "Nowhere particular," Wyatt had answered, the same response he'd given 100 times before. The storekeeper had nodded knowingly. "Running from the law." "No." The answer came too quickly, too defensively. "Ah, woman troubles then." The man had grinned, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. "Or maybe just troubles." Wyatt had paid for his supplies and left without another word, but the encounter lingered. What did the storekeeper see when he looked at Wyatt Callahan? A drifter, certainly. A man who moved like he was always leaving somewhere, never arriving. A man with ghosts riding behind him. Now, at his isolated camp, Wyatt pulled his journal from his saddlebag. The leather cover was worn smooth from years of handling the pages inside, filled with terse entries that charted his meandering path across the Western Territories. He hadn't started keeping it for any particular reason, perhaps just to prove to himself that he existed, that he was more than just a shadow passing through other people's lives. May 17, 1885. Crossed Gila River. Low water. Heading east. He stared at the blank space below his last entry pencil hovering. What was there to add? Another day of riding, another night alone. The sun rose, the sun set, and Wyatt Callahan remained a man without roots, without purpose, beyond the next horizon. He thought of the letter he'd received 2 months ago, forwarded through a half-dozen post offices before finally catching up to him in Yuma. His sister in Boston, informing him of their mother's passing. He'd read it, standing in the dusty street, feeling nothing but a distant, hollow ache. By the time the letter found him, his mother had been in the ground for nearly 4 months. He hadn't seen her in 9 years. "You're welcome home any time, Wyatt," his sister had written at the end. "There's always a place for you here." Home. The word had lost its meaning somewhere along the way. Wyatt had folded the letter carefully and tucked it into his journal, then ridden out of Yuma that same afternoon. East, not north, toward Boston. Away, not toward. A coyote howled in the distance, the sound carrying clearly in the still night air. Another answered, then a third. A conversation of sorts. More company than Wyatt had known in weeks. He closed the journal without adding a word. What would he write? That he was 35 years old, and had nothing to show for it but scars and memories he'd rather forget. That sometimes in the darkest hours of the night, he wondered if this was all there would ever be, just him and his horse riding from nowhere to nowhere until age, or a bullet, or simple bad luck finally caught up with him. Wyatt tossed the dregs of his coffee into the fire, watching it hiss and sputter. The truth was, he didn't know how to live any other way anymore. The army had taught him how to track, how to shoot, how to survive. It had also taught him about betrayal, about the fragility of trust. The years after had only reinforced those lessons. Better to be alone, better to keep moving, better not to need anyone. He lay back on his bedroll rifle within easy reach and stared up at the vast sweep of stars. The Milky Way stretched across the sky like a river of light, distant and untouchable. Tomorrow, he'd ride east, following no path but his own. No destination in mind, just the familiar rhythm of hooves against earth and the weight of his past, growing no lighter, no matter how far he traveled. 3 days later, he would find a wounded Apache woman in a dry creek bed, and everything would change. The Arizona Territory. Heat bore down mercilessly, turning the air into a shimmering veil that distorted the distant mountains. Summer of 1885 showed no mercy to those who traversed its unforgiving landscape. The dried creek bed stretched like a pale scar across the parched earth, once flowing waters, now just a memory written in smooth stones and cracked mud. Wyatt Callahan moved with the practiced caution of a man who had learned survival through blood and loss. His weathered hat cast a shadow over vigilant eyes that never stopped scanning the horizon, a habit formed during his years as a cavalry scout from 1870 to 1873, then reinforced by a decade of solitary wandering. At 35, the lines etching his face spoke of violence, witnessed and dealt in equal measure. The weight of his Colt revolver against his hip was as familiar as his own heartbeat. He paused to take a swig from his canteen, the tepid water offering little relief from the heat. Some men carried their histories in letters and photographs, treasured mementos of lives well lived. Wyatt carried his in scars, the puckered circle below his collarbone, where a Comanche arrow had nearly found his heart, the jagged line across his ribs from a knife fight in Dodge City. Each mark, a chapter, each scar, a lesson in survival. He stopped abruptly, instinct making his hand hover near his holster. A dark shape lay crumpled against the pale stones ahead, too still to be an animal, too small to be a fallen horse. Years of violence had taught Wyatt caution. Men sometimes played dead, waiting for fools to come close. As he drew closer, he saw it was a woman, her dark hair tangled across her face, her side stained with blood that had dried almost black in the heat. She was Apache. The recognition sent a ripple of unease through him. In this territory, being caught near an injured Apache could mean questions from soldiers, suspicion from settlers, or worse, revenge from her people if they thought he had harmed her. Something deep and instinctual told him to turn back, to continue down the creek bed as if he'd seen nothing. But as he turned to leave, he caught the slight rise and fall of her chest. She was alive. A memory flashed across his mind, himself, lying wounded in the dust, watching the retreating backs of men he'd called companions as they fled an ambush, abandoning him to certain death. The copper taste of betrayal filled his mouth, even now, years later. He remembered the burning thirst, the certainty of approaching death, and the desperate crawl toward a water hole that had saved his life. He crouched beside her, pushing his hat back. The wound looked bad. A rifle round had torn across her ribs, not a clean shot, but a grazing blow that had ripped flesh and muscle. It had bled heavily, though the worst seemed to have stopped. Without treatment, infection would claim her within days. His hands hovered uncertainly over her wound. He was no doctor. The few medical skills he possessed were rough, at best learned from patching up himself and others in the heat of necessity. As he reached for his canteen, her eyes snapped open. They were dark alert despite the fever radiating from her skin. She flinched at his shadow, then focused on his face with unexpected clarity. Her lips moved dry and cracked, but the voice that emerged carried surprising strength and perfect, unaccented English. "Easy, Cowboy. You'll break my back." Wyatt froze, taken aback, not just by her words, but by the incongruity of hearing such perfect English from an Apache woman bleeding out on sun-baked stones. "You're hurt bad," he said, his voice rough from disuse. Won't make it without help." She gave a short, bitter laugh that turned into a grimace of pain. "Then don't do it like you're breaking a horse." Wyatt didn't respond. He uncorked his canteen and poured a careful measure of water over the wound to clear away the dust and dried blood. She gasped, her body tensing, but she didn't cry out. Her resilience surprised him. Most men would be howling with a wound like hers. "I need to move you," he said, eyes scanning the horizon. The empty landscape could fill with threats at any moment, other Apache soldiers, bounty hunters. "Not safe here." The woman studied him with a piercing gaze. "Why help me? Most would ride on." Wyatt didn't have a ready answer that wouldn't expose too much of himself. "Maybe I'm not most," he finally said, reaching for the small medical kit in his saddlebag. It wasn't much catgut for stitching a needle, a small bottle of whiskey for disinfecting. "I'm Elena," she said, watching as he threaded a needle. "Some call me Neil." "Wind," Wyatt translated automatically, then caught himself. Her eyebrows raised slightly at his knowledge of the Apache language. "Wyatt Callahan," he offered, focusing on the wound rather than her questioning look. "This will hurt." He poured whiskey over the wound. She tensed, a cry of pain escaping through gritted teeth. He worked quickly, stitching the torn flesh with rough, inexperienced movements. Each pass of the needle drew a sharp intake of breath, but she remained conscious, her eyes fixed on his face. "You've done this before," she observed. "Not enough to be good at it," he admitted. "Just enough to keep someone alive." "That's all I'm asking for," she replied. When he finished, Wyatt wiped his bloodied hands on a bandana. The stitches were crude, but would hold if she didn't move too much. "There's a hunting cabin about 2 miles west," he said. "If you can ride." "I can ride," she said, though the pallor beneath her copper skin suggested otherwise. He helped her onto his horse, mounting behind her. Her body was light against his chest, burning with fever, yet somehow still carrying a dignity that made him conscious of every point of contact between them. They rode in silence, Wyatt acutely aware of Elena's increasingly labored breathing. By the time the cabin came into view, a weathered structure half hidden among juniper trees, Elena had begun to slip in and out of consciousness. The cabin was dusty, but intact. A single room with a stone fireplace, a crude table, and a cot pushed against one wall. Wyatt laid Elena carefully on the cot, then made the place habitable, starting a fire, fetching water from a nearby spring, clearing away the worst of the dust. As darkness fell, the cabin grew warm from the fire's heat. Wyatt checked Elena again, pressing a hand to her forehead. The fever was still there. He soaked a bandana in cool water and placed it gently on her forehead. Night had fallen by the time Elena regained full consciousness. She found Wyatt seated at the table cleaning his rifle by the light of the fire. The methodical click and scrape of metal against metal paused as she stirred. "How long?" she asked, her voice steadier than before. "Few hours," he replied. "Fever's still high. Should drink water." She struggled to sit up, wincing at the pull of the stitches. Wyatt offered a tin cup of water. She took it with both hands, her fingers brushing against his. "You stitch like a man who's never mended anything but saddles," she said, but there was no real criticism in her tone. "Never claimed otherwise." Elena studied him openly. "You speak Apache?" "Some. Enough to get by. Most white men don't bother. Most white men don't spend 3 years scouting alongside Apache trackers," he said, immediately regretting revealing so much. Her eyes sharpened with interest. "Military?" Wyatt reassembled his rifle, the practiced movements requiring no thought. "Once, 4th Cavalry, 1870 to 73, long time ago." Elena didn't press further. Instead, she shifted the conversation. "I was at San Carlos," she said, referring to the Apache reservation. "4 years. Until I couldn't stand it anymore." "The hunger?" Wyatt asked, knowing conditions there were often dire. "That. And the waiting." She looked into the cup as if it held memories rather than water. "Watching my people waste away waiting in lines for food that never came, for promises never kept. I decided I wouldn't die waiting for someone else's mercy." Wyatt nodded, understanding what it meant to choose survival over submission. "You should eat," he said, eventually nodding toward the pot of beans still warm by the fire. "Later," she replied. "First, tell me why a white man who speaks Apache is riding alone in the desert far from any town." "Same reason as you. Prefer the company of the desert to that of most people." "Running from something," she pressed. "Everyone out here is running from something." He deflected. "Or toward something that keeps moving just out of reach." Elena accepted this with a slight nod. "Well, Mr. Callahan, it seems we're both running in the same direction for now. Get some rest," he said. "We'll figure out the next steps in the morning." Elena finished the water, their fingers brushing once more. "Thank you," she said simply, "for stopping, for helping." As Elena settled back, Wyatt returned to his place at the table. He ran his thumb along the worn edge of his holster, then removed his revolver. Each night before allowing himself to rest, he meticulously checked the weapon, a ritual that had kept him alive through years of drifting. Tonight, it felt different. He wasn't just protecting himself anymore. Outside, an owl called its cry lonely in the vast darkness. The world beyond the cabin walls continued its ancient rhythms, indifferent to the small human drama unfolding within. He changed her bandage the next morning. The wound looked angry and inflamed, but there was no sign of blood poisoning spreading from it. As he worked, he noticed something tucked into the inner pocket of her leather vest, the corner of a folded paper with what looked like a map grid visible. Elena caught his glance. "Curious cowboy." Wyatt finished securing the fresh bandage. "Your business is yours." She studied him a moment, then reached into her pocket and withdrew a folded document, hesitating before handing it to him. "This is why they're hunting me," she said. It was a land survey map showing territorial boundaries with official-looking markings. He recognized the style immediately, having seen similar documents during his time with the Army. But something was off about it. "These boundaries are wrong," he said, pointing to a section he recognized. "This is Apache land, but it's marked as public domain." Elena's expression was grim. "Yes, and this one, and this one." She pointed to other sections. "All stolen with the stroke of a pen, then sold to mining companies and cattle barons." Wyatt studied the map more carefully, noting official stamps and signatures. The document had an air of legitimacy, but he could spot subtle discrepancies, the wrong type of ink, in places inconsistencies in the handwriting. "Where did you get this?" "My brother, Takoda," she said, her voice softening with grief. "He worked as a translator for the Indian agency. We were close. He raised me after our parents died of smallpox when I was 9. He discovered what they were doing, redrawing maps, forging documents, stealing land that was guaranteed to us by treaty. And they killed him for it." Wyatt guessed the pattern all too clear. Elena nodded, her eyes holding a pain deeper than any physical wound. "He knew they were coming for him. He gave me this, told me to run, to get it, to someone who could expose the truth." Her voice caught. "They shot him in the back while he was creating a diversion for me to escape. He was only 28. The depth of her loss resonated with Wyatt. He had seen too much of the injustice she described, had been complicit in it during his time with the Army, following orders he knew were wrong. Who's behind it? Captain Victor Holloway, she said, practically spitting the name. Former Army, now leads a group of bounty hunters. But he's really working for land speculators and mining interests. The name hit Wyatt like a physical blow, though he kept his expression neutral. Victor Holloway, a name from his past one he'd hoped never to hear again. The man who had left him for dead, who had ordered his unit into an ambush and then abandoned those who fell. Holloway's put out word that I'm a dangerous Apache woman, wanted for theft and murder. Elena continued, unaware of the impact the name had on Wyatt. The bounty hunters who shot me thought they'd found their prize. Wyatt handed the map back, his mind racing. If Holloway was involved, the corruption went deeper than just local officials. The captain had connections in territorial government, perhaps even in Washington. You need to heal before you can do anything about this, he said. A few more days, at least. Elena tucked the map away, frustration evident in her movements. Every day I wait is another day they have to cover their tracks to sell off more of our land. Won't matter how righteous your cause is if you're dead, Wyatt said bluntly. Her eyes flashed with anger, then softened as she recognized the truth. And what about you, Wyatt Callahan? Why involve yourself in an Apache woman's troubles? You could ride away right now, forget you ever found me. It was a fair question. The simplest answer was that he couldn't leave someone to die when he had the power to help. But there was more to it now. The mention of Holloway had changed everything. Let's just say I have my own reasons to be interested in Captain Holloway's activities, he said carefully. Elena's perceptive gaze searched his face. He wronged you, too. It wasn't a question, but Wyatt nodded a curt acknowledgement. We have a history. The next few days fell into a cautious rhythm. Wyatt hunted for fresh meat, checked for signs of pursuers, and tended to Elena's wound. She regained strength, gradually moving from the cot to sitting at the table, then to short walks outside. Her fever broke on the third night, and with it came a sharpness of mind that Wyatt found himself appreciating. She was educated, he realized, not just in the English language, but in history, literature, even politics. She explained that she had been sent to a federal Indian boarding school from 12 to 17, part of the government's effort to kill the Indian, save the man. They thought they could erase who I was, she said one evening, as they sat outside watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of fire. Make me forget my language, my beliefs, my people. Instead, I learned to live in both worlds and to see how one world constantly encroaches on the other. Wyatt noticed a distant look enter Elena's eyes as she gazed toward the horizon, her mind clearly traveling back to that time. When she spoke again, her voice had grown softer, tinged with memories she rarely shared. I was 12 when they came for us, she said. Men from the Indian Agency with soldiers to ensure cooperation. They took all the children between 6 and 14. We were loaded into wagons like cattle, not allowed to say proper goodbyes to our families. She drew her knees up to her chest, arms wrapping around them as if seeking protection from the memories. The school was 3 days' journey away, a collection of stark brick buildings surrounded by high walls. They cut our hair the first day. The boys' heads were shaved completely. For the girls, they cut it to our shoulders. Her hand unconsciously touched her long black hair. They told us long hair was uncivilized, primitive. The superintendent said it was the first step in killing the savage to save the man. Wyatt remained silent, recognizing the rare trust she was showing by sharing these painful memories. They gave us new names, Elena continued. Christian names chosen from a list. I became Ellen because a teacher thought it sounded similar enough to my Apache name that I might respond to it. Some children refused to answer to their new names. They were beaten until they learned. She fell silent for a moment, her gaze fixed on something Wyatt couldn't see, the ghosts of a childhood stolen. The first 6 months I tried to escape 3 times. The third time they kept me in solitary confinement for a week, in a storage closet, barely big enough to lie down in. Her voice remained steady, but her knuckles had whitened where she gripped her knees. After that, I realized the only way to survive was to become what they wanted. Outwardly, at least. "So you learned their language," Wyatt said quietly. Elena nodded. "Better than most. I discovered that knowledge could be a weapon, a shield. If I excelled at their subjects, English, arithmetic, history, even their Bible studies, I could earn small privileges, access to the school library, permission to help in the kitchen instead of scrubbing floors, eventually the ability to write letters home, though I learned later that most were never delivered." A faint, bitter smile crossed her face. "I became their model student, their success story. 'See how well the savage can be tamed,' they would tell visitors. All the while at night I would whisper the stories and songs of my people to the younger girls in our dormitory, making sure they wouldn't forget who they really were." "You protected them?" Wyatt observed. "I tried." Elena's voice caught slightly. "Some didn't survive. Disease spread quickly in those crowded dormitories. Measles, influenza. Some simply lost their will to live, stopped eating, stopped speaking. The school cemetery had too many small graves." She paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. "There was one teacher, Miss Fairchild, who was different from the others. She recognized my intelligence, gave me advanced books to read. Shakespeare, Dickens, even political treatises. She taught me that not all white men's words were meant to destroy. Some could illuminate, inspire." Elena's expression softened slightly at the memory. "She risked her position to teach me things beyond the approved curriculum. I think she saw the injustice of what was happening, though she never said so directly." "She sounds like a good woman," Wyatt said. "She was. She died in my 4th year there. Consumption." Elena's face clouded again. "After she was gone, I focused on learning everything I could about white society, their laws, their systems. I realized knowledge of both worlds might someday help my people." She uncurled from her protective posture, straightening her spine as if casting off the weight of the memories. "When I was 17, they declared me successfully civilized and sent me back to the reservation expecting me to be a model of assimilation for others. They didn't understand that I had only been playing a role wearing a mask." "But the mask became part of you," Wyatt suggested gently. Elena looked at him sharply, then her expression softened in acknowledgement of the truth in his words. "Yes, I cannot deny that. I returned to my people fluent in English, knowledgeable about white ways, carrying books and ideas that seemed foreign to them. My own mother looked at me as if I were a stranger." Pain flashed across her face. "Only Dakota, my brother, truly welcomed me home. He had avoided the schools somehow. He helped me find my place, again remember the ways I had been forced to forget." "And now you live between worlds," Wyatt said, understanding in his voice. "As do you in your way," she replied, studying him with those perceptive eyes. "The military scout who now rides alone. The man trained to lead others into Apache territory, who now helps an Apache woman. We are both outsiders, Wyatt Callahan. Perhaps that's why fate brought us together." The sun was beginning to sink toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the land. Elena stood brushing dust from her clothing with a gesture that seemed to also brush away the heaviness of the past. "Come," she said, turning toward the cabin. "Night is coming, and we should prepare. Holloway will not give up so easily. Wyatt was quiet for a long moment. Must be hard, he finally said. Not fully belonging to either. Elena glanced at him, surprised by his insight. Yes, the Apache see me as too white in my thinking. The whites see me as just another savage no matter how well I speak their language. So you belong nowhere, Wyatt said, the words carrying the weight of his own experience. And everywhere, she countered, her gaze returning to the horizon. Sometimes not belonging anywhere means you can belong anywhere you choose. The words stirred something in Wyatt, a longing he usually kept buried beneath layers of caution and solitude. Later that night, unable to sleep, Wyatt stepped outside. The desert night was cool and vast, stars scattered across the black expanse like silver dust. He heard Elena's soft footsteps behind him, but didn't turn. You never said why, she spoke quietly. Why you helped me. Why you're still helping me. Wyatt kept his eyes on the stars. I was left behind once, he said, finally, the words coming slow and difficult. Cattle drive up north, ambush. Men I rode with scattered. I was down bleeding out. They rode on, left me for dead. He paused, the memory still raw despite the years. Survived anyway. Crawled 3 miles to a water hole. Took me months to recover. And you didn't want to do the same to someone else, Elena finished for him. Something like that. She stepped closer, standing beside him now, both of them looking up at the stars. Thank you, she said simply. They stood in silence, two displaced souls finding momentary peace in the quiet vastness of the desert night. The peace was broken the next morning when Wyatt, returning from checking the perimeter, spotted dust on the horizon, riders moving with purpose toward the cabin. Time to go, he said, bursting through the door. Riders coming. 3, maybe 4. Elena was already on her feet, gathering their few possessions. Holloway. Can't tell, but they're riding hard and coming straight here. Wyatt checked his revolver, then slung his rifle over his shoulder. How's the wound? I'll manage, she said, her jaw set with determination. They were saddling Wyatt's horse when the riders came into clear view. 4 men heavily armed with the unmistakable look of bounty hunters. Leading them was a figure Wyatt recognized immediately, tall and broad-shouldered, with a silver beard and the bearing of a military man. Captain Victor Holloway. His hawk-like nose had been broken at least twice, giving his face an asymmetrical quality that only enhanced the cold calculation in his pale blue eyes. A distinctive gold front tooth flashed when he spoke, and his right earlobe was missing entirely. Rumor had it bitten off in a bar fight. Despite being in his 50s, his muscular physique strained against his expensive tailored clothes, and he wore 2 matching ivory-handled revolvers on a tooled leather gun belt, positioned for the cross-draw he was famous for. The sight of him sent a cold shock through Wyatt's system, followed by a surge of old rage. Too late to run, Wyatt said, positioning himself between Elena and the approaching riders. Stay behind me. The riders halted about 20 yards from the cabin. Holloway's eyes passed over Wyatt without recognition before settling on Elena. Well, well, Holloway called out, his voice carrying easily in the still air. The Apache thief found at last. What do you want, Holloway? Wyatt asked, keeping his voice steady despite the anger churning inside him. Holloway's gaze shifted to Wyatt, narrowing slightly. I've got papers saying an Apache woman matches her description. Wanted for theft of government property and the murder of an Indian agency official. Show me these papers, Wyatt demanded. Holloway hesitated, then nodded to one of his men, who produced a folded poster. The man rode forward slowly and handed it to Wyatt. The poster described an Apache woman wanted for theft and murder with a substantial reward offered for her capture. The description included specific identifying marks, a scar on the right shoulder, and an eagle tattoo on the left wrist. "She doesn't match this description," Wyatt said, turning back to Holloway. "No scar, no tattoo. You've got the wrong woman." Holloway's face hardened. "Looks Apache found near where the theft occurred. Close enough for me to take a closer look." "Show them," Wyatt said quietly to Elena. Elena stepped forward, pushing up her sleeve to reveal an unmarked wrist, then pulling aside her collar to show her shoulder also unmarked, save for the fresh wound from the bullet. "As you can see, Captain Holloway," she said, her voice cool and steady, "I am not the woman you're looking for." Holloway's eyes narrowed further, clearly displeased, but unable to dispute the evidence. The bounty hunters exchanged glances, one of them a younger man with a nervous energy, shifting uncomfortably in his saddle. "Maybe she's hiding the marks," one of the other men suggested. "Could be covered up. Or maybe," Wyatt said, his hand casually resting near his holster, "you're so desperate for bounty money that you're willing to take in any Apache woman you find, whether she matches the description or not." Holloway's face flushed with anger. "Watch yourself, stranger. Interfering with lawful bounty hunters is a crime in this territory." "So is falsely imprisoning innocent people," Wyatt countered. "Or did that change while I wasn't looking?" For a tense moment it seemed Holloway might order his men to take Elena by force. Then the younger bounty hunter spoke up. "Captain, she doesn't match the marks. We can't bring in the wrong person." Holloway shot him a venomous look, but seemed to reconsider. "We'll be watching," he finally said, addressing both Wyatt and Elena. "And when we find proof you're who we're looking for, we'll be back." With that, he wheeled his horse around and rode off, his men following. The younger bounty hunter cast one last glance back at them, something like apology in his eyes. Wyatt and Elena stood watching until the dust from their departure settled back to earth. "They'll be back," Elena said quietly. "Yes," Wyatt agreed. "But not today. And that's enough for now." The night after Holloway's visit, they slept fitfully, taking turns keeping watch. By dawn, both had reached the same conclusion: they couldn't stay at the cabin. It was only a matter of time before Holloway returned with more men, or worse, sent word to the territorial militia about hostile Apache activity in the area. They packed quickly, taking only what was essential. Elena's wound had begun to heal, but the long ride ahead would test her endurance. As Wyatt secured the last of their meager supplies to his horse, he cast a final glance at the cabin. It wasn't much, but for a few days it had been something close to a haven. "We'll find another," Elena said, reading his thoughts with surprising accuracy. They set off as the morning sun cleared the eastern mountains, riding south initially to throw off potential pursuers, planning to loop back toward the trading post by midday. The terrain was rugged, a maze of arroyos and rocky outcroppings that provided cover but slowed their progress. Around noon, they paused in the shelter of a sandstone formation. Wyatt shared the last of their jerky, while Elena checked her wound. The bleeding had stopped, but the pain was evident in the tightness around her eyes. "How far to the trading post?" she asked, carefully rewrapping the bandage. 4 hours, maybe 5, at this pace," Wyatt replied, scanning the horizon. "We'll need to be careful. Holloway might have men watching it." They were about to remount when the distant sound of hoofbeats froze them in place. Wyatt drew his rifle, pushing Elena behind the rocks. But as the riders came into view, he realized they weren't bounty hunters. 3 Apache men on horseback, riding hard from the east. "They're from my people," Elena whispered, her expression a complex mixture of relief and apprehension. The riders slowed as they spotted them, hands moving to weapons. Wyatt kept his rifle ready, but pointed downward, a gesture of caution rather than immediate threat. The lead rider, a man of perhaps 40, with a face weathered by sun and hardship, addressed Elena in Apache. His tone was demanding, suspicious. "He wants to know why I'm with a white man," Elena translated quietly. "He says they've been tracking us since dawn." Before Wyatt could respond, she stepped forward and spoke to the men in her native tongue, her voice steady and clear. The exchange was rapid, occasionally heated. Wyatt understood only fragments, enough to know she was explaining about Holloway, the forged documents, her brother's death. The lead rider dismounted, approaching Elena with narrowed eyes. He pointed at her wound, then at Wyatt, his question obvious even without translation. "He thinks you shot me," Elena explained. "I told him you saved my life, but they're suspicious. These men knew my brother. They were hunting when they found his body." The Apache warrior studied Wyatt with hard eyes, then spoke again to Elena, gesturing eastward. "He says I should return with them to the band," she translated, "that it's too dangerous for me to be alone with a white man, especially heading toward a settlement." "Tell him you're not alone," Wyatt said, meeting the warrior's gaze steadily. "Tell him you have someone watching your back." Elena relayed his words. The warrior's expression didn't change, but he spoke again, this time directly to Wyatt in halting but understandable English. "Why, white man, help Apache woman what you want?" It was a fair question, one Wyatt had been asking himself since the moment he found Elena. The simple answer, that he couldn't leave someone to die, seemed insufficient, faced with the warrior's penetrating stare. "Because I know what it's like to be left behind," Wyatt said finally. "And because what's happening to her people is wrong. The land thefts, the murders. I've seen enough injustice." Elena translated for the other men. There was a brief discussion, the tension gradually easing from their postures. The leader turned back to Wyatt. "You go to trading post Dangerous. Holloway men there." "We need supplies," Wyatt explained. "And we're heading to Tucson after. She has evidence of what Holloway is doing, stealing Apache land. Evidence that could stop him." Another quick conversation in Apache followed. Then the leader nodded once sharply. "We help. We know safe way." For a moment, Wyatt hesitated. Trust didn't come easily to him, especially with strangers. But Elena stepped closer to him, her hand briefly touching his arm. "They were friends of Dakota," she said quietly. "They want justice for him as much as I do." The decision made, they followed the Apache riders, leaving the main trail for a network of game paths that wound through the roughest terrain. Progress was slow, but concealed from prying eyes. The Apache moved with, "You know him," Elena said as Wyatt re-stitched her wound that night. It wasn't a question. Wyatt's hands stilled for a moment. "Yes, he was my commanding officer during my time as a scout." "And the one who left you for dead," Elena concluded, connecting his earlier story with today's confrontation. "Holloway ordered us into Apache territory." Wyatt continued, his voice flat with old pain. "Said it was just reconnaissance, but we were too heavily armed for that. I had a bad feeling from the start, but followed orders anyway." He tossed the bloody rag into the fire. "We rode into a canyon-perfect place for an ambush. I tried to warn him, but he called me a coward. Then the shooting started." "Who ambushed you?" Elena asked softly. "Apache warriors. They were waiting for us like they knew exactly where we'd be." Wyatt's eyes reflected the dancing flames lost in the past. "I took a bullet in the leg, another in the shoulder. Couldn't ride. Holloway and the others just left. Didn't even look back." Elena reached out slowly, placing her hand on his arm. "And now he's here and he doesn't recognize you." "No." Wyatt said, a bitter smile touching his lips. I was just another expendable scout to him, not worth remembering. Then he doesn't know what's coming for him, she said fiercely. What are you thinking? That we have a common enemy, and that perhaps fate brought us together for a reason. Wyatt considered this. He'd spent years avoiding entanglements, commitments, anything that might lead to vulnerability. Yet, here he was already committed to a course that could only lead to confrontation with the man who had left him for dead. Holloway isn't just after me, Elena continued. He's using his position to steal land from my people, to line his pockets with gold bought with Apache suffering. He needs to be stopped. And you think the two of us can stop him? Wyatt asked skeptically. With the evidence I have, yes. Elena's eyes were bright with conviction. We need to get to Tucson, to the federal marshal's office. Show them the maps, the forged documents. Wyatt stood pacing the small confines of the cabin. The plan was straightforward, but the risks were enormous. We'd need supplies, he said finally. More ammunition, food for the trail. There's a small trading post about 15 miles south. We could go there, then head to Tucson. Wyatt nodded, his decision crystallizing. We'll leave at dawn. Try to put as much distance between us and Holloway as we can before he realizes we're gone. As they prepared for sleep, Elena caught Wyatt's arm. Thank you, she said, her voice soft but strong. For believing me, for helping me. Something shifted between them in that moment, a recognition, an understanding that transcended words. They left at dawn, Wyatt leading the way with Elena behind him on the horse. As the sun climbed higher, the heat returned with a vengeance. Elena's grip around his waist tightened occasionally when the horse's movement pulled at her wound, but she made no complaint. Her resilience impressed him, though he wasn't surprised. The Apache were known for their toughness, and Elena had survived more than most. By mid-afternoon, they reached a small rise overlooking the trading post, a weathered wooden structure surrounded by hitching posts and a dusty clearing. 2 wagons stood near the porch, and a few horses were tied at the rail. More people than I'd like, Wyatt muttered. Let's wait, see who comes and goes. After an hour of observation, the scene appeared quiet enough to risk a visit. They approached at an unhurried pace, Wyatt keeping his expression neutral while his senses remained alert. The interior of the trading post was dim, the air heavy with the smell of tobacco and leather. Behind the counter stood a heavy-set man with a graying beard eyeing them with cautious interest. "Afternoon," the shopkeeper greeted them, his gaze lingering on Elena. "Need some supplies," Wyatt said, moving to the counter. "Coffee, ammunition, salt, dried beef if you've got it." "Heading where?" the shopkeeper asked as he gathered the items. "South," Wyatt lied smoothly. "Down to the border." The door opened, admitting a tall man with a deputy's badge. Wyatt felt Elena tense nearby. "Morning, Jackson." The deputy greeted the shopkeeper, then nodded to Wyatt. "Stranger." The deputy's gaze shifted to Elena, his eyes narrowing. "She with you, my wife," Wyatt said without hesitation. "Half Mexican. We're heading south to visit her family." The deputy studied Elena for a long moment. "Funny, she don't look Mexican to me." Elena turned to face him, her expression carefully composed. "My father was Mexican, deputy," she said, her perfect English carrying just a hint of an accent now. "My mother was Yaqui." "Is there a problem?" Wyatt asked, his tone pleasant, but with an edge of warning. "No problem," the deputy replied slowly. "Just being cautious. Had reports of an Apache woman causing trouble, and the territory pays good money for bringing in troublemakers." "Well, we're not looking for trouble," Wyatt said, gathering his purchases. just supplies for the journey. They left with deliberate calm. Once they were mounted and heading away, Elena said quietly, "He didn't believe you." "No, we need to move fast. He'll talk and word will spread." They rode hard for the rest of the afternoon, cutting west instead of south, as Wyatt had told the shopkeeper. As the sun began to sink, Wyatt searched for a defensible place to camp. Elena pointed to a cluster of boulders nestled against a low mesa. "Good cover, and we can see anyone approaching." They made camp with minimal fuss. No fire, just a cold meal from their supplies. Wyatt spread his bedroll for Elena, insisting she get what rest she could. "You know we're being followed, don't you?" she asked softly, as she settled onto the bedroll. Wyatt nodded. "Saw dust on the horizon before sunset. Could be anyone, but it's probably Holloway," she finished. Hours passed. The moon set, leaving only stars to illuminate the desert. Wyatt was about to wake Elena for her turn at watch, when he heard it, the soft clink of metal on stone, barely audible, but unmistakable. Someone was approaching their camp. Wyatt moved silently to Elena's side, placing a hand gently over her mouth as he woke her. Her eyes snapped open, instantly alert. He put a finger to his lips, then gestured toward the entrance of their shelter. She nodded, reaching for the revolver he had given her earlier. They waited, every sense straining in the darkness. A figure emerged, moving cautiously toward their hiding place. Then another, and a third. Moonlight glinted off gun barrels. "Now," Wyatt whispered, and they both fired simultaneously. The night exploded into chaos. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness, the crack of gunfire echoing off the stones. Wyatt heard a cry of pain as one of his shots found its mark. "Wyatt Callahan!" a voice called out, not Holloway's, but vaguely familiar. "We know it's you. We just want to talk." "My name's James Parker," the voice continued. "I was with Holloway's bounty hunters, the young one who spoke up yesterday." As Parker stepped closer, Wyatt could make out more details in the starlight. A tall, lanky figure with a distinctive limp favoring his right leg. His face was youthful, but marred by a jagged scar that ran from his left temple to the corner of his mouth, giving him a perpetual half-smile that contrasted with the seriousness in his eyes. Wyatt remembered the young bounty hunter who had pointed out that Elena didn't match the description. "Why should I believe you?" Wyatt called back. "Because I'm alone now," Parker replied. "The other two were Holloway's men sent to follow you. I've been tracking all of you." "Show yourself," Wyatt demanded. "Hands up, no weapons." After a moment of hesitation, a figure rose from behind a rock, hands raised high. In the starlight, Wyatt could make out the features of the young bounty hunter. "What do you want?" Wyatt asked when Parker was about 10 feet away. "To help you," Parker said. "Holloway isn't who he pretends to be. He's not just a bounty hunter, and that Apache woman isn't really wanted for any crime." "We know," Elena said, stepping into view but keeping her revolver trained on Parker. "He's forging documents to steal Apache land." Parker's eyes widened. "You have proof?" "We do," Wyatt confirmed. "Now why would a bounty hunter want to help us expose his employer?" Parker's expression hardened. "Because Holloway killed my brother. Made it look like an accident during a hunt, but I know better. Thomas was an army surveyor. He discovered what Holloway was doing with the land records and threatened to report it." The story rang true, aligning with what they already knew about Holloway. Wyatt and Elena conferred privately, then decided to accept Parker's help, but keep a close watch on him. Parker returned with his horse and supplies, reporting that Holloway had sent 4 men after them. 2 are somewhere to the east, thinking you headed for the border." "And Holloway himself?" Wyatt asked. "Still at his camp near the trading post. He's expecting reports back, but he's not personally joining the hunt yet. Parker offered them jerky from his saddlebag. He's got too much invested in this land scheme to risk showing his hand. They set off at dawn, Wyatt and Elena on one-horse Parker on his bay, heading northward toward Tucson. The terrain grew increasingly rugged flat desert, giving way to rolling hills and deeper canyons. Parker proved to be a competent tracker, occasionally pointing out signs that Wyatt had missed. Despite his initial suspicion, Wyatt found himself grudgingly impressed with the young man's skills. "How did you learn to track like that?" Elena asked, as they rested by a spring at midday. "My father was a scout like you," Parker replied, nodding to Wyatt. "Taught me and my brother everything he knew before the consumption took him." "My brother discovered the same thing as yours," Elena said quietly. "Holloway had him killed too." Parker looked at her with newfound understanding. "I'm sorry." The moment was interrupted by the distant neigh of a horse. They moved swiftly, seeking cover behind boulders. Two riders approached the spring, dismounting to fill canteens. "So, told you I saw tracks heading this way," one was saying. "Fresh, too. Can't be more than an hour old. $50 says it's the Apache woman and that fella with her. Holloway wants 'em bad." "Bounty hunters," Wyatt whispered. They needed those horses, and they couldn't let the men report back to Holloway. Wyatt and Parker fired simultaneously, wounding, but not killing the bounty hunters. "Don't move," Wyatt shouted, stepping from cover with his rifle trained on the wounded men. "Hands where I can see them." They searched the men, finding wanted posters with Elena's description, and now Wyatt's as well labeled as an accomplice to theft and murder. "What do we do with them?" Elena asked. "We'll take their guns and horses," Wyatt decided, "and leave them enough water to make it back to the trading post on foot." With 2 additional horses, they continued northward, pushing harder now. As evening fell, they found themselves in mountainous terrain, the air growing cooler with the altitude. "We should stop for the night soon," Parker suggested. "There's a place I know," Elena spoke up. "A cave in the hillside about 2 miles from here. My father brought me here when I was young. He taught me to hunt in these mountains, to read the signs of the land." The cave provided perfect shelter hidden from view, but large enough for them and their horses. For the first time since leaving the cabin, they risked a small fire. With flames casting shadows on the cave walls, they prepared a simple meal. Elena revealed more about her past, how her family had lived free until she was 10, when soldiers rounded up all the Apache they could find and forced them onto the reservation. "And then the boarding school," Wyatt added. "Yes, the white man's final solution to the Indian problem, kill the Indian, save the man." Elena's eyes reflected the firelight. "They thought they were saving us. They didn't understand they were destroying worlds." The cave fell silent. Parker looked uncomfortable, perhaps confronted for the first time with the reality of what his people had done to hers. "I'm sorry," he said finally. They discussed their plans for reaching Tucson. The town was still 2 days' ride away, assuming no further delays. Parker sketched a map in the sand, showing the terrain and potential danger points. "The worst stretch is here." He indicated a section of trail that wound through a narrow pass. "Perfect place for an ambush, if Holloway figures out where we're headed." "We could go around," Wyatt suggested. "Adds a day to the journey," Parker pointed out. "Better slow than dead," Elena countered. They decided on a compromise. They would approach the pass cautiously, scout it thoroughly, and only proceed if it appeared safe. As the fire burned down to embers, they arranged watches for the night. Despite the day's tensions and the uncertainty ahead, there was a growing sense of camaraderie among them, a shared purpose that transcended their different backgrounds. The next morning they rode single file down the narrow trail, Parker in the lead, followed by Elena with Wyatt bringing up the rear. The extra horses followed on lead ropes. By mid-morning, they had descended from the higher elevations, approaching the pass Parker had mentioned. They halted in a clearing to rest the horses and plan. "I'll scout ahead," Parker offered. "Make sure the pass is clear." Wyatt handed him a small mirror. "If there's trouble, catch the sunlight. We'll see the flash and know to take the alternate route." Parker disappeared into the brush, moving with the silent efficiency of a practiced tracker. Wyatt and Elena waited the minutes stretching into an hour with no sign of his return. "Something's wrong," Wyatt said finally. "He should have been back by now." "Should we follow?" Elena asked. "Not both of us. You stay with the horses, be ready to take the alternate route if necessary. I'll find out what's keeping him." "Be careful," Elena said, touching his arm briefly. Wyatt followed Parker's trail to the edge of the clearing, then into a denser stand of pine and juniper. The forest was quiet, too quiet, he realized. No birdsong, no rustle of small animals. Something had disturbed the natural rhythm of the place. He slowed his pace, moving from tree to tree. About 30 yards from a rocky outcrop, he saw a flash of color against the gray stone Parker's bandana caught on a jutting rock, but no sign of Parker himself. The ground told the story, scuff marks in the dirt signs of a struggle, and drag marks leading away from the outcrop and down toward the pass. Parker had been captured. Wyatt followed cautiously, keeping to cover. At the bottom of the pass, he could make out several figures around a small camp. Using sparse cover, he worked his way closer until he could see the scene clearly. 4 men heavily armed and tied to a tree at the edge of the camp, Parker his face bloodied but conscious. These were Holloway's men, using Parker as bait. Wyatt retreated, making his way back to Elena. "Parker's been captured," he reported tersely. 4 of Holloway's men have him in the pass. They're waiting for us. "They'll kill him if we don't come," Elena said, her expression hardening, "and try to kill us if we do. It's a trap, plain and simple." They considered their options. The alternate route would add a day to their journey, giving Holloway more time to prepare. But rescuing Parker meant facing 4 armed men in terrain of their choosing. "We can't leave him," Elena said finally. "He risked himself to help us." Wyatt nodded, having reached the same conclusion. Whatever his initial suspicions, Parker had proven himself an ally. "We'll need a diversion," he said. "Something to draw their attention while I get to Parker." Elena's eyes lit with determination. "I can provide that." "Too dangerous," Wyatt objected immediately. "You're their primary target." "Exactly," she countered. "They want me, Vanandi, more than they want you. If I show myself briefly on the ridge above the pass, they'll focus on me. You can use that moment to free Parker." The plan was risky, but sound. Wyatt found himself impressed with her tactical thinking. "There's a lot that can go wrong," he warned. "There's a lot that will definitely go wrong if we do nothing," Elena replied. "Parker dies, and we spend an extra day on the trail, while Holloway prepares for us in Tucson." They spent an hour planning the rescue. Wyatt circled wide around the pass, approaching from the opposite side, from where Elena would create her diversion. It was slow, painstaking work, but eventually he reached a position about 30 yards from where Parker was tied. From his vantage point, Wyatt could see all 4 bounty hunters. 2 were playing cards at a small fire. 1 was keeping watch near the entrance to the pass, and the 4th was standing near Parker, occasionally prodding him with the toe of his boot. Wyatt waited for Elena's diversion, his revolver ready. He didn't wait long. Elena had executed her part perfectly, just long enough to be spotted, but not long enough to be targeted. From his position, Wyatt saw one of the card players leap to his feet, pointing excitedly. "There she is!" The man's voice carried clearly in the still mountain air. "The Apache woman. up on the ridge. The bounty hunter's reaction was immediate and chaotic, exactly as Wyatt had hoped. Two of them snatched up their rifles and began scrambling toward the slope, while a third shouted orders, gesturing wildly. The fourth man, the one guarding Parker, hesitated, caught between watching his prisoner and joining the chase. Wyatt held his breath, waiting for the perfect moment. The guard looked up at the ridge again, shielding his eyes against the sun, momentarily distracted. Now, with the stealth honed from years as a scout, Wyatt slipped from boulder to boulder, closing the gap to Parker. The young bounty hunter's eyes widened as he spotted Wyatt's approach, but he had the presence of mind not to react visibly. Instead, he slumped forward, as if overcome by exhaustion or despair, drawing his guard's attention. "Sit up, boy," the guard growled, prodding Parker with his boot. "No fainting on my watch." Parker mumbled something incoherent, slumping further. The guard cursed and bent down, grabbing Parker's collar to haul him upright. It was the opening Wyatt needed. 3 quick strides brought him behind the guard. In one fluid motion, Wyatt clamped his left hand over the man's mouth, while his right brought the knife handle down hard at the base of the skull. The guard collapsed without a sound, unconscious but alive. "That was close," Parker whispered as Wyatt cut through the ropes binding his wrists. "Another minute, and they might have decided to use me as bait up on that ridge." "Can you move?" Wyatt asked, eyeing the 2 bounty hunters who were now halfway up the slope, shouting to each other as they searched for Elena. Parker nodded, rubbing circulation back into his wrists. "They roughed me up some, but nothing broken. Where's Elena?" If she followed the plan, already heading back to the rendezvous point. Wyatt handed Parker the guard's revolver. "Keep low. We move on my signal." From their position, Wyatt could see the remaining bounty hunters standing near the campfire, rifle at the ready, scanning both the ridge and the surrounding terrain. The man was nervous, shifting his weight from foot to foot, clearly uncomfortable being left alone with an unconscious comrade and no sign of their target. Wyatt analyzed their options. The most direct route back to Elena would take them right past the watchful bounty hunter. The longer route would require crossing open ground where they'd be exposed to the men on the ridge. Neither option was good. "We need a distraction," Wyatt muttered. Parker's eyes lit up. "I've got an idea." He pointed to a cluster of loose rocks at the edge of their cover. "Those come down, it'll sound like someone's approaching from the east. When he turns to look, we go west." Wyatt finished, nodding approval. "Do it!" Parker took careful aim with the revolver and fired. The shot ricocheted off the rocks, sending a shower of stone fragments and dust cascading down the slope. The effect was immediate. The bounty hunter by the fire whirled toward the sound, bringing his rifle up. "Who's there?" he shouted. "Jenkins Thompson!" Wyatt grabbed Parker's arm, and they sprinted in the opposite direction, keeping low behind a line of boulders. They'd covered about 20 yards when a shout went up behind them. "The prisoner's gone! They're over there!" A shot rang out, the bullet whining off stone inches from Wyatt's head. They dove behind a larger boulder as more shots followed. "So much for the quiet approach," Parker gasped. "Time for Plan B," Wyatt said grimly, checking his revolver. "We had a Plan B?" Parker asked, eyebrows raised. "Run faster." Wyatt pointed to a narrow gap between rock formations about 30 yards ahead. "That leads to a gully. We can follow it up to the ridge and circle back to Elena." "Ready," Parker nodded, tightening his grip on the revolver. "After you." They broke cover simultaneously, Parker firing blindly toward the camp to keep the bounty hunter's head down while Wyatt led the way to the gap. More shots rang out behind them, but the hasty aim went wide. They reached the gap and squeezed through, finding themselves in a dry stream bed that wound upward toward the ridgeline. "Keep moving," Wyatt urged as they scrambled up the rocky terrain. "They'll be right behind us," making it to cover before anyone noticed. But their luck couldn't hold. As they crouched behind the boulders, a shout went up from the camp. Parker's absence had been discovered. "Move!" Wyatt urged, leading the way from boulder to boulder. Behind them, shots rang out, bullets sparking off rock as the bounty hunters opened fire. Halfway up the slope, Parker stumbled, clutching his side. Wyatt saw the spreading stain of blood he'd been hit. Without hesitation, Wyatt hooked Parker's arm over his shoulders, half carrying him up the remainder of the slope. They plunged into the cover of the trees. The bounty hunters were coming, but more cautiously now. They had nearly reached the clearing where Elena waited when Wyatt heard it, the unmistakable sound of a rifle being cocked behind them. "That's far enough, boys," a voice drawled. "Turn around real slow." One of the bounty hunters had circled around, cutting off their escape route. The man had the drop on them, but he was alone. Wyatt's mind raced, calculating angles, distances, chances. The crack of a rifle shot broke the silence. The bounty hunter's expression froze in surprise. Then he crumpled to the ground, revealing Elena standing behind him, rifle still raised to her shoulder. "You were supposed to wait with the horses," Wyatt said, more relieved than angry. "You were taking too long," Elena replied, simply lowering the rifle. "Parker's hurt. Caught a bullet in the side," Parker confirmed, his voice strained with pain. They hurried to the horses. "The alternate route," Wyatt decided, pointing to a trail that led away from the pass. "They'll expect us to continue north. This will take us east before curving back." They rode hard, pushing the horses as much as they dared. Behind them, they could hear occasional shouts as their pursuers tried to pick up their trail. By late afternoon, they had reached a small plateau overlooking mountains and valleys stretching toward the horizon. "We should stop," Elena suggested, indicating Parker. "He needs his wound tended." The young bounty hunter had grown progressively paler during the ride, the blood stain on his shirt alarmingly large. Wyatt guided them to a small hollow sheltered by aspens with a spring nearby. "Bullets still in there," he observed grimly after examining the wound. "Needs to come out." Elena offered Parker a small leather pouch from her saddlebag. "Chew this. It will help with the pain." While they waited for the medicine to take effect, Wyatt heated his knife in the small fire they had built, sterilizing it as best he could. He worked quickly, probing the wound to locate the bullet. Parker's body tensed, a muffled scream escaping through his gritted teeth. Elena held him steady, murmuring words of encouragement. The bullet came free with a sickening sound, and Wyatt tossed it aside. Elena took over, applying a poultice of herbs to the wound before binding it tightly with strips of clean cloth. Parker had lost consciousness. "Will he make it?" Wyatt asked as they moved away. "If infection doesn't set in," Elena replied, washing blood from her hands in the spring. "The herbs will help, but it's always a risk with bullet wounds." As darkness fell, they made a simple camp. Parker remained unconscious, which was probably a mercy. Wyatt and Elena took turns watching over him, changing the poultice when necessary. During one of these vigils, Wyatt found himself reflecting on the day's events. They had risked everything to save Parker, a man who had been a stranger to them just days ago. It was a choice that defied the cold logic of survival that had governed Wyatt's life for so long. Yet, it had felt right. Something was changing within him. He glanced at Elena's sleeping form. Her fierce commitment to justice, her refusal to abandon her principles, even in the face of overwhelming odds, had awakened something in him that he had thought long dead. A belief that some things were worth fighting for. Parker stirred, his eyes fluttering open. "Water," he rasped. Wyatt helped him drink. "How's the pain?" "Like I've been kicked by a mule," Parker admitted with a weak smile. "But I'll live." He glanced around. "Where are we?" "Safe for now. About a day's ride from Tucson, once you're strong enough to travel." Parker nodded, settling back with a grimace. "Thank you," he said after a moment, "for coming back for me." "You'd have done the same," Wyatt replied, surprised to find he believed it. "Maybe," Parker said, "but not everyone would have." He looked at Wyatt with newfound respect. "You're a good man, Callahan. Better than most in this territory." Wyatt wasn't sure how to respond. For years he had cultivated a reputation for coldness, for putting survival above all else. The idea that he might be seen as good was unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable. "Get some rest," he said finally. "We've got a long ride ahead of us." Dawn broke over the mountains, bathing the landscape in golden light. Wyatt woke to find Elena already up, checking on Parker. The young bounty hunter was awake, pale but alert. "Fever?" Wyatt asked, joining them. "No," Elena replied, adjusting the bandage. "The herbs helped. The bleeding has almost stopped." Parker grimaced as he tried to sit up. "I can ride," he insisted. "Might not be pretty, but I can stay in the saddle." They broke camp quickly, helping Parker onto his horse. The trail wound down from the high country, gradually descending toward the valley where Tucson lay. Wyatt kept a vigilant eye on their surroundings, alert for any sign of pursuit. By mid-morning, they reached a vantage point overlooking the valley. In the distance, the adobe buildings of Tucson shimmered in the heat haze. "We made it," Elena said softly, a note of wonder in her voice. "Not yet," Wyatt cautioned. "Still a half-day's ride, and plenty can happen between here and there." They continued their descent, the trail gradually widening as it approached more traveled routes. By early afternoon, they reached the main road leading into Tucson. Traffic increased, wagons loaded with supplies, riders coming and going, even a stagecoach rumbling past in a cloud of dust. "Where will we find the federal marshal?" Elena asked, as the buildings of Tucson grew larger before them. "Courthouse," Parker replied. "West end of town. Marshal Cooper keeps his office there." "Cooper?" Wyatt's head snapped toward Parker. "Samuel Cooper." "You know him." Samuel Cooper had been a captain during Wyatt's time with the Army, one of the few officers who had treated the scouts with respect rather than contempt. If Cooper was now the federal marshal, their chances of being heard fairly had just improved significantly. "We served together," Wyatt said simply, "a long time ago." They entered Tucson. As the afternoon waned, the streets crowded with the day's final business. The courthouse stood at the western part of town, a two-story building of red brick with white trim. A flag hung limply in the still air above the entrance, and deputies lounged on the porch. "Wait here," Wyatt instructed, pulling up in front of a small hotel across from the courthouse. "I'll see if Cooper's in his office." "I should come with you," Elena objected. "The evidence is safer with you for now. If Cooper's not there or if something doesn't feel right, we need to be able to leave quickly." Elena reluctantly agreed. Wyatt crossed the street, aware of the deputy's eyes, tracking his movement. "Help you?" one of them asked as Wyatt climbed the courthouse steps. "Looking for Marshal Cooper. Tell him Wyatt Callahan's here. We served together in the 4th Cavalry." The deputy disappeared inside while Wyatt waited. Minutes stretched by the sun sinking lower. Finally, the deputy returned. "Marshal'll see you." Wyatt stepped inside. The deputy led him to a door marked "Federal Marshal" in gold lettering. Inside, a man rose from behind a large desk. Samuel Cooper had aged in the years since Wyatt had seen him last, his hair now more gray than brown lines etched deeper around his eyes, but he still carried himself with the straight-backed posture of a military man. His massive hands, each finger thick as a sausage, and covered in weathered scars, matched his imposing, bear-like frame. Most striking was the milky white of his left eye, the result of a knife fight years ago that had taken his sight on that side, but none of his commanding presence. A carefully trimmed mustache, thick and silver, concealed the top half of a burn scar that distorted his upper lip. "Callahan," Cooper said, extending his hand. "Been a long time. Captain, or I suppose it's Marshal now. For about 5 years. Sit down. What brings you to Tucson?" Wyatt remained standing. "I need to know if I can trust you, Cooper." The Marshal's eyebrows rose slightly. "That's a hell of a greeting after all these years. I'm not here for a reunion. I've got evidence of land fraud against the Apache. Evidence that's gotten people killed. Before I bring it to you, I need to know where you stand." Cooper closed the door. "You always were direct, Callahan. Ask what you need to ask." "Victor Holloway," Wyatt said, watching Cooper's face closely. "What do you know about him?" Cooper's expression darkened. "Holloway. Now, there's a name I haven't heard in a while. Former Army, now runs a bounty hunting operation north of here. Why, he's involved in forging land documents, stealing Apache territory, selling it to mining interests. That's a serious accusation. You have proof." "Enough to hang him," Wyatt confirmed. "But Holloway has connections. I need to know if any of those connections lead to this office." Cooper's jaw tightened. "I resent the implication, Callahan. In all the years we served together, did I ever give you reason to doubt my integrity?" "No," Wyatt admitted. "But I've seen enough corruption in this territory to be cautious." "Fair enough. Let me be clear. I have no connection to Holloway or any mining interests. If you have evidence of fraud, I want to see it. That's my job." Wyatt studied the Marshal's face, then nodded satisfied. "I'm not alone. I have 2 companions waiting across the street. One of them is an Apache woman with the documents. The other is a wounded bounty hunter who was working for Holloway before he learned the truth." Cooper raised an eyebrow. "You certainly know how to complicate things, Callahan. Bring them in, but use the back entrance." He pointed to a small door at the side of the building. "Less visible from the street. I'll have my deputy meet you there." As Wyatt crossed the street, he caught sight of a rider at the far end of the thoroughfare watching the courthouse with too much interest to be casual. Holloway's man, perhaps. Their arrival in Tucson hadn't gone unnoticed. He reached Elena and Parker, explaining the situation quickly. "Cooper seems trustworthy, but we're being watched. We'll use the back entrance." The deputy was waiting as promised, ushering them into a small anteroom. Jenkins was a mountain of a man with skin the color of polished mahogany, standing well over 6 feet tall with shoulders like an ox. Despite his intimidating size, he moved with surprising grace, and a gentle stutter punctuated his soft-spoken words. His left hand was missing 2 fingers, and the elaborate silver mechanism that replaced them clearly of his own design clicked softly as he gestured for them to follow. A badge of the Buffalo Soldiers was pinned proudly beside his deputy star, speaking of his military past. Parker was struggling now, the long ride having taken its toll on his wounded body. Wyatt supported him as they followed the deputy to Cooper's office. The Marshal stood as they entered, his eyes taking in the unlikely trio. "Marshal Cooper, this is Elena and James Parker." Once they were seated, Elena took the lead, removing the documents from her pouch and spreading them on Cooper's desk. "These are land surveys for the Apache territory north of here," she explained. "The originals showing the boundaries as established by treaty." She then produced the forged documents. "These are the forgeries that Holloway and his conspirators have been filing with the Land Office. You can see how they've altered the boundaries, converting Apache land to public domain, which is then sold to private interests. Cooper examined the documents, carefully comparing the originals to the forgeries. His expression grew increasingly grave. "The forgeries are good," he admitted. "Without the originals to compare them to, they might have passed inspection. Who else knows about this? My brother Dakota discovered it first." Elena said, her voice steady, despite the pain of the memory. "He was both my brother and my guardian after our parents died from smallpox when I was 9. He worked as a translator for the Indian agency, which gave him access to the official documents. Holloway had him killed when he threatened to expose the scheme." "My brother, too," Parker added weakly. "Army surveyor. He saw the discrepancies in the new maps." Cooper looked up sharply. "How high does this go? Who else is involved?" "We know about the Copper Creek Mining Company," Wyatt said. "They're the ones buying up most of the stolen land. But there must be others involved at the land office, maybe even in territorial government." "The land commissioner," Parker supplied, "a man named Garrett. He's the one who processes all the paperwork." Cooper sat back. "This is bigger than Holloway. He's just the muscle. The real conspiracy goes into the territorial administration." "Which means we need to move carefully," Wyatt observed. "If word gets back to them that we're here—" "It probably already Cooper acknowledged grimly. "Tucson's not that big, and people notice strangers." He gathered up the documents, placing them in a drawer, which he locked. "These need to be kept safe until I can bring in federal investigators from outside the territory." "How long will that take?" Elena asked, anxiety creeping into her voice. "A week, maybe 2. I can send telegrams today, but it will take time for Washington to respond and send agents." "We don't have that kind of time," Wyatt objected. "Holloway knows we're here. He'll come for us and for those documents." "Then we need to secure both," Cooper said decisively. "You'll stay here under my protection until the federal agents arrive." A knock at the door interrupted them. The deputy had returned with the town doctor, who began examining Parker while Cooper showed Wyatt and Elena to rooms upstairs. "It's not much," Cooper apologized, "but you'll be safe here." "Safe is relative when Holloway's involved," Wyatt remarked, checking the room's escape routes, a habit born of years of caution. "I have men I trust," Cooper assured him. "They'll keep watch." Left alone with Elena, Wyatt moved to the window, looking down at the street below. The day was waning, shadows lengthening as the sun sank toward the western horizon. "You're not used to being in one place, are you?" Elena observed, sitting on the edge of a narrow bed. "Not for a long time. Always felt safer moving." "And now, how do you feel about being here waiting?" Wyatt turned to look at her. "Like a sitting duck. Cooper's a good man, but Holloway has resources connections. He won't just wait while the federal investigators make their way here." Elena nodded, understanding his concerns. "What do you suggest? We stay alert. Cooper can provide protection, but we're responsible for our own safety." A knock at the door announced Cooper's return, with a tray of food and a grim expression. "News?" Wyatt asked. Cooper nodded. "Holloway's been seen in town, checked into the Grand Hotel about an hour ago, bold as brass." "He's making his move," Wyatt said. "Probably has men positioned throughout the town. I've doubled the guards and sent telegrams to the federal authorities marking them urgent, but it will still take time for help to arrive." "And Garrett, the land commissioner?" "Left town suddenly this afternoon. Claimed a family emergency in Phoenix. My deputy checked the land office files have been cleared out, including all the recent surveys. They're covering their tracks," Wyatt concluded, which means they know we're here and what we have. Cooper nodded grimly. The only advantage we have is the original documents. Without them, it's just accusations without proof. Then we protect those documents with our lives, Elena said firmly. They discussed security arrangements for the night, Cooper assigning trusted deputies to guard the building in shifts. From the window of their room, Wyatt watched the town settle into darkness, punctuated by the warm glow of oil lamps and the occasional movement along the boardwalks. Elena joined him at the window, her shoulder almost touching his as they gazed out at the night. Peaceful, she observed. Hard to believe there's so much corruption beneath the surface. It's always that way, Wyatt replied. People going about their lives never seeing the rot underneath until it breaks through. Is that why you left civilization behind? Because you saw too much of the rot. Partly, he admitted. Partly because I couldn't find a place where I fit anymore. After the war, after what happened with Holloway, I didn't trust anyone enough to stay in one place. And now, Elena's voice was soft, almost hesitant. Before Wyatt could respond, a movement in the street below caught his attention. A group of men moving with purpose toward the courthouse. "Cooper!" he called sharply, not taking his eyes from the street. The marshal appeared in the doorway. "What is it?" "Trouble," Wyatt said, pointing to the men gathering at the corner across from the courthouse. "Those aren't ordinary citizens out for an evening stroll." Cooper joined them at the window, his expression hardening. "Holloway's making his move sooner than I expected." As if on cue, the crack of gunfire erupted from the street. One of Cooper's deputies fell. The other guards returned fire diving for cover as bullets splintered the wooden porch. They're creating a diversion, Cooper realized. The real target is the safe. "Jenkins!" he shouted for his deputy. "Go!" Wyatt told Elena. "Stay with Cooper. I'll get Parker." Without waiting for a response, Wyatt headed for the room where Parker was recovering. He found the young bounty hunter already alert, struggling to sit up, despite his wound. "Holloway," Parker guessed, grimacing with pain. "And friends," Wyatt confirmed, helping him to his feet. "Can you move?" Parker nodded grimly, leaning heavily on Wyatt. "Just give me a gun and point me in the right direction." Wyatt handed him a revolver and supported him as they made their way to the staircase. The sounds of gunfire continued outside, joined now by shouts and the breaking of glass. They descended the stairs cautiously, finding Cooper and Elena in the hallway outside the marshal's office. Cooper had a shotgun in his hands while Elena held a revolver. "They've surrounded the building," Cooper reported tersely. "At least 10 men, probably more. They're well armed and coordinated." "The safe?" Wyatt asked. "Still secure, but they'll breach the building soon. We can't hold them off indefinitely." A crash from the front of the courthouse confirmed Cooper's assessment. The attackers had broken through the main doors. Gunfire erupted in the entrance hall as Cooper's deputies engaged them. "This way," Cooper ordered, leading them toward the back of the building. "There's a secure room in the basement. We can hold out there until reinforcements arrive." They moved quickly through the hallway, Wyatt bringing up the rear, helping Parker along while keeping a wary eye behind them. They reached a heavy wooden door, which Cooper unlocked with a key from his ring. Beyond the door, stone steps led down into darkness. Cooper lit a lantern, illuminating a narrow staircase descending to the basement level. "Go," he urged. "I'll be right behind you." Elena went first, followed by Parker, still leaning heavily on Wyatt. The basement was cool and damp with stone walls and a packed earth floor. Cooper led them to another door, this one made of iron-banded oak. "The strong room," he explained, unlocking it. "Used to store evidence and valuable items. Solid walls, one entrance. Defensible." Inside the room was spare, but sufficient, A table chairs, shelves stocked with supplies, and a small arsenal of weapons. Cooper had clearly prepared for the possibility of a siege. "I took the liberty of moving the documents here earlier," he said, indicating a metal box on the table. "Had a feeling Holloway wouldn't wait for the federal investigators." Wyatt helped Parker into a chair, then checked the weapons Cooper had stockpiled. Rifles, shotguns, revolvers, and plenty of ammunition. Enough to hold off a significant force, assuming they could maintain control of the single entrance. "How many men do you have left upstairs?" Wyatt asked. "4, maybe 5, if Jenkins made it back from the doctor's office," Cooper replied grimly. "Good men, but outnumbered." The sounds of gunfire above intensified briefly, then fell silent. The sudden quiet was more ominous than the chaos that had preceded it. "They've taken the main floor," Cooper said. "It won't take them long to find the basement entrance." "We need to get word out," Elena said urgently. "Is there another way out of here?" Cooper shook his head. "No, but there's this." He moved to a corner of the room, pulling aside a canvas tarp to reveal a telegraph key mounted on a small table. "Direct line to the army post at Fort Lowell." He sat down at the key and began tapping out a message. "Requesting immediate assistance. Courthouse under attack by armed criminals. Federal marshal and witnesses in danger." A response came almost immediately. Cooper listened, his expression lightening slightly. "They're sending a detachment. 20 men should be here within the hour." "If we can hold out that long," Wyatt observed, moving to the door to listen for sounds of approach. Footsteps echoed on the stone stairs, followed by a voice that sent a chill through Wyatt's blood. "Marshal Cooper, I know you're down there. Let's talk like civilized men." "Holloway." The voice was exactly as Wyatt remembered it, confident, commanding, with an undertone of contempt. Cooper glanced at Wyatt, raising an eyebrow in question. Wyatt shook his head fractionally. Talking would only give Holloway time to position his men for an assault. "Nothing to talk about, Holloway," Cooper called back. "You've attacked a federal courthouse and killed federal officers. That's a hanging offense. Surrender now, and you might avoid the noose." Holloway's laugh echoed down the stairwell. "Bold words from a man trapped in his own basement. I have 15 men up here, Cooper. Your deputies are dead or captured. No one's coming to help you." "Fort Lowell disagrees," Cooper replied calmly. "Army's on its way. You've got maybe an hour before this place is surrounded by U.S. cavalry." A moment of silence followed. Then Holloway's voice, again less confident now. "The documents. That's all I want. Give them to me, and we'll be gone before the army arrives. No one else needs to die today." Elena shook her head firmly, her hand moving to the metal box on the table. "Not a chance, Holloway," Cooper called back. "Those documents prove you've been stealing Apache land. They're evidence in a federal investigation now." Another pause, longer this time. When Holloway spoke again, his voice had hardened. "Have it your way, Marshal. But remember, I offered a peaceful solution." Footsteps retreated up the stairs, leaving them in momentary silence. "He's going to try to smoke us out," Parker said weakly from his chair. "Or find another way in. Holloway doesn't give up easily." "Neither do we," Elena said firmly, checking the revolver Cooper had given her. Wyatt moved away from the door, joining them at the table. "He'll be back with more men and a plan. We need to be ready." They prepared as best they could, positioning furniture for cover, distributing weapons and ammunition, and setting up a rotation for watching the door. "Why is it so important?" Wyatt asked Elena. "The land. Holloway and his conspirators are risking everything for it." "Copper," she replied grimly. "The mountains north of here are rich with it. The mining companies have been trying to gain access for years, but the treaties protect Apache land from exploitation. So they forge documents, redraw boundaries, and suddenly, it's public land open for mining claims, Cooper finished. With copper prices rising due to the demand for electrical wiring, there are fortunes to be made. And my brother died for it, Elena said softly, along with others who tried to expose the fraud. A sound from above interrupted their conversation. Footsteps on the stairs again, heavier this time, multiple men descending. Wyatt and Cooper moved to defensive positions, rifles aimed at the door. "Last chance, Cooper," Holloway's voice called. "The documents for your lives. Simple trade." "Not going to happen, Holloway," Cooper replied firmly. "The army's on its way. You should be riding hard in the opposite direction if you want to avoid a hanging." "The army's not coming," Holloway said, and there was a new confidence in his voice that Wyatt didn't like. "We cut the telegraph line to Fort Lowell 20 minutes ago. Your message never went through." Cooper's face paled. He glanced at the telegraph key, which had indeed been silent since that first exchange. "He's bluffing," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Am I?" Holloway challenged. "Test it yourself, Marshal. See if Fort Lowell responds." Cooper moved to the telegraph key, tapping out a query. No response came. He tried again, more urgently this time. Still nothing. "You see," Holloway called, "no one's coming to save you. It's just us now, and I have all the time in the world." Wyatt exchanged a glance with Cooper, reading the concern in the marshal's eyes. If the army wasn't coming, their position was far more precarious than they had believed. Before anyone could respond, wisps of smoke began seeping beneath the door, followed by a hissing noise that grew louder. "Fire," Parker said, struggling to his feet. "He's trying to smoke us out." The smoke thickened rapidly, filling the room with acrid fumes that burned their eyes and throats. Cooper moved quickly to the water barrel, soaking several cloths. "Cover your mouth and nose," he instructed, distributing the damp cloths and demonstrating by tying one around his own face. Even with this protection, breathing became increasingly difficult as more smoke poured in. Wyatt's eyes stung, tears streaming down his face. "We can't stay here," he coughed. "The smoke will kill us before the fire does." Cooper nodded grimly. "There's another way out," he said, moving to the far corner of the room. He pushed aside a heavy cabinet, revealing a small iron grate set into the floor. "Drainage tunnel," he explained, working to lift the grate. "Runs to the wash behind the courthouse. I didn't mention it earlier because it's risky, but now we don't have a choice." The grate came free, revealing a dark opening, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through, with a ladder of iron rungs descending into the blackness. "Elena, first, then Parker," Cooper ordered. "Wyatt and I will cover the door in case they try to rush us when they realize we're escaping." Elena took the metal box containing the documents and secured it inside her shirt before approaching the opening. Without hesitation, she lowered herself onto the ladder and disappeared into the darkness. Parker followed with difficulty, his wound clearly paining him. Wyatt helped as much as possible, then turned back to Cooper. "Your turn, Marshal," he said, coughing as the smoke grew thicker. Cooper shook his head. "Someone needs to hold them off, give you time to get clear." He pressed a folded paper into Wyatt's hand. "Map of the tunnel. It branches. Take the right fork, leads to the wash about 100 yards from here. Left fork's a dead end." His eyes lingered meaningfully on the map for a moment longer than necessary, and he added with quiet emphasis, "Remember that, Callahan. Right fork to the wash. Left fork's a dead end." Something in Cooper's tone made Wyatt pause. The marshal had always been calculating, never one to sacrifice himself without a plan. But there was no time to question him further. "Cooper," Wyatt began to protest. "No time to argue." Cooper cut him off. "Those documents are more important than any of us. Get them to Fort Lowell. Find Captain Reynolds. He's a good man. He'll help." The sound of splintering wood came from the door Holloway's men were breaking through. "Go," Cooper urged. "I'll buy you as much time as I can." With a final nod of respect to the marshal, Wyatt lowered himself into the tunnel. The last thing he saw was Cooper positioning himself behind an overturned table shotgun aimed at the weakening door. The tunnel was as narrow as Cooper had warned, forcing Wyatt to move in a crouch. Water trickled along the bottom, soaking his boots. The darkness was absolute, relieved only by occasional grates in the ceiling that let in thin shafts of moonlight. He caught up to Parker and Elena at a junction in the tunnel. "Right fork," Wyatt directed, remembering Cooper's instructions. "Left's a dead end." Above them, muffled by earth and stone, came the sound of gunfire, then a louder explosion that shook dust from the tunnel ceiling, Cooper apparently making his final stand. The gunfire ceased abruptly after the explosion. Wyatt silently saluted the marshal's courage, promising himself that the man's sacrifice would not be in vain. Still, something nagged at the back of his mind about Cooper's insistence on the tunnel forks, almost as if the marshal had been telling him more than just directions. After what seemed an eternity, they reached the end of the tunnel. A rusted grate blocked the exit, but years of corrosion had weakened its moorings. Wyatt pushed against the grate with all his strength, feeling it give way with a grinding protest. They emerged into the wash behind the courthouse, a dry stream bed that ran through the edge of town. The night air was cool and clean after the smoke-filled confines of the basement, and for a moment they simply stood, breathing, deeply grateful to be alive. The courthouse loomed behind them, firelight flickering in its windows. Shouts and occasional gunshots could still be heard, but less frequently now. Cooper's resistance was ending. "We need to move," Wyatt said quietly. "Holloway will figure out where we went soon enough." "Where?" Parker asked, leaning heavily against the bank of the wash. "The town's not safe, and I don't think I can ride far in this condition." Wyatt considered their options. The documents were the priority they needed to get them to someone with authority who couldn't be bought or intimidated. Cooper had suggested Fort Lowell, but that was miles away, and Parker was in no condition for such a journey. "The church," Elena suggested, "at the edge of town. Father Ignacio. He's helped my people before, stood against the territorial government when they tried to remove children from their families." Wyatt nodded. A church would provide temporary sanctuary, and a sympathetic priest might be able to help get word to Fort Lowell. They made their way carefully through the darkened streets, staying to shadows and alleyways. The town was eerily quiet, most citizens having locked themselves in at the first sound of gunfire. Only the occasional patrol of Holloway's men disturbed the stillness, forcing them to hide more than once. The church stood on a small rise at the eastern edge of town, its adobe walls pale in the moonlight, the bell tower a dark silhouette against the star-filled sky. A single light burned in a window beside the main building, the priest's quarters. They approached cautiously, circling to the back door rather than the more exposed front entrance. Wyatt knocked softly, alert for any sign of movement in the surrounding area. After a moment, the door opened a crack, revealing the face of an elderly man with a white beard and kind eyes that widened at the sight of the bedraggled trio. Father Ignacio was small in stature, barely reaching Wyatt's shoulder, but his presence filled the space around him. His hands were gnarled like ancient mesquite roots, each knuckle swollen with arthritis, yet they moved with surprising grace. Most notable was the intricate pattern of geometric tattoos that covered the backs of his hands up to his wrists, remnants of his youth among indigenous people in Mexico before taking his vows. A long scar across his throat suggested a story of violence and survival, though his gentle melodious voice gave no hint of damage. "Father Ignacio?" Elena asked. "Yes, my child," the priest replied, his gaze taking in their disheveled appearance and Parker's obvious injury. Without further question, he opened the door wider. "Come in quickly." Once inside, the priest locked the door securely and led them to a small, simply furnished room. A crucifix hung on one wall, and bookshelves lined another filled with volumes in several languages. "You are in trouble," Father Ignacio observed. It wasn't a question. "Men are hunting us," Wyatt confirmed. "Men who have already killed tonight and won't hesitate to kill again." The priest nodded gravely. "I heard the gunfire from the courthouse. What has happened?" Elena quickly explained their situation while the priest examined Parker's wound, his gnarled hands moving with surprising gentleness. "And Marshal Cooper?" Father Ignacio asked, his eyes showing concern. "You are certain he perished?" "He stayed behind to cover our escape," Wyatt said grimly. "The courthouse was burning. Holloway's men were breaking down the door. No one could have survived that." The priest nodded slowly, but his expression remained thoughtful. "I have known Samuel Cooper for many years. He is not a man who dies easily, nor without purpose." He crossed himself. "But we shall pray for his soul and focus now on protecting what he gave his life to defend." Wyatt found himself strangely comforted by the priest's words, though he couldn't say why. There had been something in Cooper's eyes, something in his insistence about the tunnel forks. But no, that was just wishful thinking. "The church can offer you sanctuary," he said, "but only temporarily. This man Holloway, he does not sound like one who would respect the sanctity of this place for long." "We need to get to Fort Lowell," Wyatt explained. "The documents Elena carries prove a conspiracy to steal Apache land. They need to reach the army before Holloway can destroy them." Father Ignacio nodded. "I have a wagon. It is not fast, but it is sturdy, and I know a route to the fort that avoids the main roads." "You'd take us yourself?" Elena asked, surprised. "It is my duty to help those in need," the priest said simply, "and to stand against injustice when I see it." He rose, moving to a cabinet from which he retrieved bandages and medicines. "First, let me tend to your friend's wound properly. Then we will leave under cover of darkness." As Father Ignacio worked on Parker's injury, Wyatt moved to the window, keeping watch on the street outside. He knew Holloway's men would be searching systematically, expanding outward from the courthouse. It was only a matter of time before they reached the church. "This is risky," he said quietly to Elena. "The wagon will be slow, easy to spot and follow." "Do we have a choice?" she asked. "Parker can't ride, and we need to get these documents to Fort Lowell." Wyatt shook his head. "No, we don't have a choice. But I want you to be prepared for what might happen. Holloway won't give up easily." "Then we'll deal with him," Elena said with quiet determination. "One way or another, this ends tonight." Wyatt found himself admiring her resolve. Through everything, the wound, the flight, the constant danger, she had maintained her courage and focus. Father Ignacio had already hitched an elderly mule to a weathered wagon and was loading it with blankets and supplies. "The blankets will hide you," he explained, helping Parker into the back. "I will cover you, and to any who stop us, I am merely an old priest making a late visit to a sick parishioner outside town." It was a thin disguise, but better than traveling openly. Wyatt and Elena joined Parker under the blankets, arranging themselves in the confined space. The metal box containing the documents remained secured inside Elena's shirt, pressed between them. Father Ignacio covered them completely, then climbed onto the driver's seat. With a soft click of his tongue, he set the mule in motion, the wagon creaking as it rolled out of the stable yard and onto a narrow track that skirted the edge of town. The journey was uncomfortable, every bump and rut in the road jostling Parker's wound and testing their endurance. The blankets made the air hot and stifling. Wyatt found himself acutely aware of Elena's proximity, her body pressed against his, her breath warm against his neck. They had been traveling for perhaps half an hour when Father Ignacio suddenly reined in the mule. Hushed voices reached them through the blankets, men stopping the wagon questioning the priest. Ignacio's responses were calm, his story apparently convincing enough that after a brief delay, they were allowed to continue. The encounter repeated itself twice more as they passed what must have been roadblocks set up by Holloway's men. The third group searched the wagon more thoroughly, prodding the blankets with rifle barrels that came dangerously close to discovering them. Finally, the sound of the town faded behind them, replaced by the night sounds of the desert. The wagon left the road following a rougher trail that wound through the wilderness toward Fort Lowell. Father Ignacio pulled back a corner of the blanket, letting in welcome fresh air. "We have left the town behind," he said softly. "Holloway's men have roadblocks on all the main roads, but this old trail is known only to a few." "How much farther?" Wyatt asked, grateful for the cooler air. 2 hours, perhaps 3, the priest estimated. "The trail is rough in places, and the old mule is not swift. But we will reach the fort before dawn." They settled back, allowing themselves to breathe more easily now. Parker had fallen into an uneasy sleep, his breathing shallow but regular. Elena remained awake, her eyes reflecting the starlight that reached them through the partially removed blanket. "What will you do?" she asked softly, her voice barely audible above the creaking of the wagon. "After this is over, after Holloway." The question caught Wyatt off guard, not because it was unexpected, but because he had been asking himself the same thing. For years, his life had been defined by movement, by the next horizon, the next temporary stopping place. The idea of after was unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable. "I don't know," he admitted, "never thought much beyond survival." "And now?" Wyatt was silent for a long moment, considering. "Now," he said finally, "I'm thinking there might be more to life than just surviving it." Elena's hand found his in the darkness, her fingers warm and strong as they intertwined with his own. "There is," she said simply. "There's belonging." The word resonated in the quiet night, echoing her earlier statement about not belonging anywhere, meaning you could belong anywhere you chose. But there was a new meaning in it now, a specificity that hadn't been there before. Before Wyatt could respond, the wagon jolted to a sudden halt. Father Ignacio's voice came to them tense with warning. "Riders approaching, many of them." Wyatt reached for his revolver, prepared to fight, but Elena's hand on his arm stopped him. "Wait," she whispered. "Listen." In the distance, the rhythmic sound of horses approaching at a trot reached them, not the chaotic gallop of Holloway's men in pursuit, but the disciplined movement of trained cavalry. The army, Wyatt realized, hope flaring within him. They must have sent a patrol when the telegraph went silent. Father Ignacio confirmed this a moment later. "Soldiers," he reported. "A full detachment by the sound of it." They pulled back the blankets, completely sitting up, to see a column of cavalry approaching along the trail, moonlight glinting off rifles and brass buttons. At their head rode an officer whose posture and bearing spoke of long military experience. Father Ignacio urged the mule forward, bringing the wagon to meet the approaching soldiers. The officer raised a hand, halting his men as the wagon drew near. "Father Ignacio," the officer greeted the priest, recognition and respect evident in his voice. "What brings you out at this hour?" "Captain Reynolds," the priest replied. "God's providence that we should meet you on this trail. I have passengers who urgently need to reach Fort Lowell." Reynolds's gaze shifted to the occupants of the wagon, sharpening as he took in their appearance. "You're from the courthouse," he said, not a question, but a statement. "We received a partial telegraph message before the line went dead. Marshal Cooper reported an attack." "Cooper's dead," Wyatt said bluntly, climbing from the wagon. "Holloway and his men took the courthouse. Cooper sacrificed himself so we could escape with evidence of a land fraud conspiracy." Reynolds dismounted, approaching Wyatt with a grim expression. "Victor Holloway, the bounty hunter, former Army, now running a bounty hunting operation that's a cover for stealing Apache land," Wyatt confirmed. "He's forging documents, redrawing boundaries to convert treaty land to public domain, then selling it to mining interests." Elena joined them, the metal box in her hands. "The evidence is here," she said, offering the box to Reynolds. "Original survey maps and the forged copies. My brother died to expose this fraud. So did Marshal Cooper and others." Reynolds examined the documents carefully, his expression darkening as he recognized the implications. "This is a federal crime," he said finally. "Conspiracy, fraud, murder. Holloway and anyone involved will hang for this." "If you catch them," Wyatt pointed out. "Holloway has men throughout the territory and connections in the territorial government. The Land Commissioner Garrett is already fleeing to Phoenix." Reynolds nodded, his decision made. "We ride for Tucson immediately. Holloway and his men will be apprehended and the courthouse secured." He turned to one of his sergeants. "Erickson, take 4 men and escort Father Ignacio and these civilians to Fort Lowell. The rest of you with me." As the cavalry detachment reorganized itself for the changed mission, Reynolds approached Wyatt once more. "You have done a great service bringing this evidence to light," he said formally. "The Army will ensure justice is done." "Not just me," Wyatt corrected, glancing at Elena and the still sleeping Parker. "We all played a part, and Cooper paid the highest price." Reynolds nodded solemnly. "His sacrifice will be honored. You have my word." The captain mounted his horse and rejoined the main body of his troops. With a sharp command, he led them at a gallop toward Tucson, the sound of hooves fading into the night as they disappeared down the trail. Sergeant Erickson and his 4 men remained, forming a protective escort around the wagon as Father Ignacio urged the mule forward once more now toward the safety of Fort Lowell. As they traveled, the first hints of dawn appeared on the eastern horizon, a pale lightening of the sky that promised a new day. Wyatt found Elena watching it too, her profile illuminated by the growing light. "It's over," she said softly. "Or it will be soon." "Holloway will face justice," Wyatt agreed. "And your people's land will be protected." Elena nodded, but her expression remained thoughtful, almost melancholy. "And then we all return to our separate lives. You to the trail, me to wherever I can find a place." The implied question hung in the air between them. Wyatt considered it carefully, aware that his answer would define not just the next few days or weeks, but perhaps years to come. "It doesn't have to be that way," he said finally. "Separate lives." Elena turned to him, hope and uncertainty mingling in her eyes. "What are you saying, Wyatt?" "I'm saying maybe we've both spent enough time not belonging anywhere," he replied, taking her hand once more. "Maybe it's time to see if we can belong somewhere. Together." The first true light of dawn broke over the horizon bathing them in golden radiance as Elena's fingers tightened around his. No words were necessary in that moment, their shared gaze speaking more clearly than any declaration. As Fort Lowell came into view in the distance, its flag visible against the brightening sky, Wyatt Callahan found himself looking forward rather than back for the first time in years. "What will you do?" Elena asked softly, her voice barely audible above the creaking of the wagon. "After this is over. After Holloway." The question caught Wyatt off guard not because it was unexpected, but because he had been asking himself the same thing. For years his life had been defined by movement, by the next horizon, the next temporary stopping place. The idea of after was unfamiliar, almost uncomfortable. "I don't know," he admitted. "Never thought much beyond survival." "And now?" Wyatt was silent for a long moment, considering. "Now," he said finally, "I'm thinking there might be more to life than just surviving it." Elena's hand found his in the darkness, her fingers warm and strong as they intertwined with his own. "There is," she said simply. "There's belonging." The first true light of dawn broke over the horizon, bathing them in golden radiance, as Elena's fingers tightened around his. No words were necessary in that moment, their shared gaze speaking more clearly than any declaration. 2 weeks later, their arrival at Fort Lowell marked the beginning of justice. Captain Reynolds sent word that Holloway and most of his men had been captured during the raid on the courthouse. The Land Commissioner Garrett had been apprehended near the Mexican border, carrying incriminating documents that further proved the conspiracy. The trial would begin within the month, and both Wyatt and Elena would be called to testify. But the most surprising news was saved for last. Marshal Samuel Cooper had survived. Though severely wounded, he had been found unconscious in the burning courthouse by Reynolds's men. He was recovering slowly at the Fort Lowell infirmary and had asked to see them. The reunion was emotional. Cooper, pale and bandaged, but very much alive, clasped Wyatt's hand with surprising strength. "Knew you'd get those documents through," he said, his voice weak but determined. "Never doubted it for a minute." "How did you survive?" Wyatt asked in disbelief. "We heard the explosion, saw the courthouse burning." Cooper's mouth twitched in what might have been a smile. "Remember when I told you the left fork was a dead end? It wasn't entirely true. There's a small chamber there, an old storage room from when they first built the courthouse. I had supplies stashed just in case." "You planned for this?" Elena asked, surprised. "In my line of work, you learn to have contingencies," Cooper replied. "After you left, I set off some dynamite to collapse the entrance tunnel, making Holloway think I'd gone down fighting. Then I took the left fork and waited until Reynolds's men cleared the building." As for Parker, his wound healed cleanly. He decided to stay in the territory, accepting a deputy position under Cooper once the marshal was fit to return to duty. "Someone needs to keep an eye on things," he said with a wry smile. "Make sure history doesn't repeat itself." When the trials concluded and the conspirators faced justice, Wyatt and Elena found themselves at a crossroads. With a small reward from the government for exposing the conspiracy, they purchased a modest parcel of land near the border of the Apache territory. It wasn't much, a small cabin, a corral for horses, and enough pasture to raise a few cattle. But it was theirs. On the porch of their new home, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains gold and crimson, Wyatt turned to Elena. "Still think I stitch like a man who's never mended anything but saddles?" he asked, a rare smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Elena laughed, touching the faint scar at her side, now almost healed. "Maybe you've improved," she conceded, "or maybe I've just gotten used to your rough edges." Like you don't have any of your own, he countered. Perhaps that's why we fit, she said softly. Our rough edges match. Wyatt nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. They were two people who had never quite belonged anywhere, who had carried their wounds and scars as shields against a harsh world. But together, they had found something neither had thought possible. Not just survival, but a life worth living. From now on, he said, taking her hand in his, we ride together. In the gathering dusk, with the first stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky, Elena smiled and squeezed his hand. Easy, cowboy, she said, echoing her first words to him. We've got all the time in the world.